The debris field smelled wrong. That was the first thing Fleet Commander Vethara noticed when her observation drone passed through the outer ring of the Karath corridor. Not the wreckage itself, not the scale of it, but the smell. Her drone carried atmospheric sensors tuned to detect propellant signatures, reactor leakage, the particular chemical fingerprint of a warship dying. She knew those readings the way she knew her own heartbeat. What she found instead was something she had no classification for. Something biological. Something that hadn't been in the corridor 6 hours ago. She pulled the sensor log a second time, then a third, because the reading was so strange she assumed instrument error. But there it was, embedded in the hull fragments of what had been a Dominion patrol frigate, evidence of accelerant compound that wasn't manufactured, wasn't refined, wasn't synthesized in any factory on any world she'd cataloged in 40 years of service. It had been grown. She flagged the reading, filed it under asterisk anomalous, pending review asterisk, and moved on. She would think about that smell for the rest of her life. What the Karath corridor meant to the Dominion was simple: control. 11 star systems funneled their supply lines through that single navigational choke point, and the Dominion had held it for 60 years without challenge. They hadn't fortified it heavily because they hadn't needed to. Any civilization rational enough to operate warships was rational enough to understand the mathematics. You didn't attack through a corridor where the defender could concentrate fire from 3 vectors simultaneously. You didn't attack through a corridor when the defender's reserve fleet sat 12 hours away at Vethara's station at Keth Solara. You didn't attack through a corridor when you were Earth. Earth, which had 16 functional warships left. Earth, which had lost its outer colonies 7 months ago. Earth, which had been formally assessed by the Dominion Strategic Intelligence Division as asterisk non-threatening, resource extraction phase recommended. That assessment had been filed 4 days before the smell appeared in the corridor debris. Vethara's second mistake, the one she would never fully forgive herself for, happened 31 hours later, when the first full sensor sweep of the corridor came back and showed her exactly what she expected to see. Nothing. No human ships, no human signatures, no evidence of any fleet activity beyond the wreckage of the Dominion frigate, which the preliminary report attributed to a reactor cascade failure, and the strange biological accelerant, which nobody had offered a better explanation for yet, but which everyone seemed comfortable ignoring. Human capability assessment, she said to her intelligence officer, a young Veth named Korath, who had been assigned to her station 6 months ago and hadn't yet learned that her questions were never as simple as they sounded. Pull the current model. Korath pulled it. 16 vessels confirmed active. Estimated combat effectiveness, 14% of pre-war capacity. Strategic assessment. I know the strategic assessment. Then, Commander, tell me how they lost the colonies. Korath hesitated. Conventional retreat, insufficient. Tell me the asterisk shape of it. She turned from the sensor display and looked at him directly, something she rarely did. Not the outcome, the sequence. How did they retreat? He was quiet for a moment, actually reading the file rather than summarizing it. She watched him find the part she already knew was there, watched his expression shift in a way she couldn't quite name. They didn't retreat in the expected pattern, he said slowly. They gave ground on the outer systems immediately, before engagement, which the model interpreted as early collapse, but then they held the secondary line for, he stopped. They held it for 11 weeks. Against what force? Our third assault group, 800 vessels. Silence. With 16 ships, Vethara said, not asking. They held an 800-vessel assault group for 11 weeks with 16 ships. The assessment notes that the defensive terrain was advantageous. The assessment, she said quietly, was written by someone who had already decided what the answer was before they looked at the data. She turned back to the sensor display. Find me everything flagged anomalous in the last 72 hours. Everything, including the smell. His name was Captain Dara Osai, and he hadn't slept in 4 days. Not asterisk couldn't asterisk sleep. Hadn't. There was a difference, and the difference mattered to him in a way he couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't commanded a warship through the kind of mathematics that made sleep feel like a moral failure. He was standing in the operations center of the Asterisk Unbroken Asterisk, which was the largest of humanity's 16 remaining warships, and which had, at last count, a crew of 412. He was looking at a display that showed him the Karath corridor, the full tactical picture, every Dominion sensor buoy, every patrol route, every response time window. And he was doing something his executive officer, Commander Yemi Sato, had learned to recognize as deeply dangerous. He was smiling. "They've run the sweep," Sato said, reading from her console. "Standard pattern. They found the frigate debris. The report will classify it as reactor failure." "Of course it will." Osa didn't move. "What did they do with the biological trace?" "Filed it as anomalous, pending review." He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "How long before they pull it out of pending?" "Standard Dominion bureaucratic timeline. Could be weeks." "We don't need weeks." He finally looked away from the display. There were lines under his eyes that hadn't been there 7 months ago, and his hands, when they weren't actively doing something, had developed a faint tremor that he was very careful to keep hidden from the crew. "We need 4 days." Sato studied him for a moment. "Dara, tell me you didn't already move them." "I already moved them." She closed her eyes. "Into the corridor." "Into the corridor." "We have 16 ships." "We had 16 ships," he said. "Now we have something more useful." He pulled up a secondary display, not the tactical picture but a logistics feed, a biological systems monitor, a count that made her breath catch when she read the numbers correctly. "Tell me what you see." She looked at the display for a long time. "That's not possible," she said finally. "It took 14 months, started before the war actually, which turned out to be lucky." He straightened up, rolled his neck once, and reached for the coffee that had been sitting beside his console for 3 hours getting cold. He drank it anyway. "The Dominion assessed us based on warships. They counted warships. They built their entire strategic model around warship counts." He paused. "Nobody ever asked what else we'd been doing." "The biological accelerant in the debris," Sato said slowly. "That wasn't from the frigate." "The frigate never had a chance to produce any accelerant at all," he said. "It was dead before it knew anything was there." Vithara found the second anomaly herself, at 3:40 station time, when everyone else on her shift had convinced themselves. The routine sweep had confirmed a routine situation and begun the mental process of winding down. It was a timestamp discrepancy. Tiny. The kind of thing that only appeared if you were running comparative analysis on sensor logs from 3 different buoys simultaneously, and happened to be looking for exactly the kind of impossibility she'd been teaching herself to expect from Earth. The frigate's reactor cascade failure had been logged at 2:11. The debris field, according to independent thermal readings from buoys 7 and 12, had begun cooling at 1:58. 13 minutes. She sat with that number for a long time. A reactor cascade failure produced debris that began cooling asterisk after the catastrophic event, not before asterisk it, not 13 minutes before it, not at any point before it. Either 2 of her sensor buoys had malfunctioned simultaneously in a way that created a coherent false reading, possible, unlikely, or the debris field had been created by something that left no propellant signature, no weapons discharge signature, no electromagnetic trace of any kind that her sensors were designed to detect. Or her sensors were designed to detect the wrong things. She opened a priority channel to Kethsolara Command and began transmitting. She was 4 words into her opening sentence when the channel went dead. Not static, not interference, not a technical fault she could diagnose. Dead. Like something had decided the conversation was over before it started. The communications array, Sato said, with the particular flatness in her voice that she used when she was processing something she hadn't expected and didn't want to show that it disturbed her. That's a significant escalation. It's a necessary one. Osai was looking at the biological systems monitor again. We have 40 hours before the Dominion Reserve Fleet reaches the corridor if they dispatch at emergency speed. If they dispatch now, which they won't, because as far as their command structure knows, there's nothing to dispatch for. And if Vethara already transmitted before we took the array down, then we have 30 hours. He shrugged, a very specific kind of shrug that Sato had learned meant he had already calculated this possibility and had already accepted the consequences. Either way, it's enough. Dara, I need you to explain to me how this, she gestured at the biological monitor, constitutes a military strategy, because what I'm looking at is alive, he said. What you're looking at is alive, and mobile, and hungry. He finally turned to face her fully, and she saw something in his expression that she had seen exactly once before, 6 months ago, when he'd laid out the original plan and she'd told him he was out of his mind. And there are 47,000 of them distributed through the corridor infrastructure right now. And the Dominion doesn't have a single weapons system calibrated to deal with a biological threat of that class. Because in 60 years of expansion, they have never once encountered a civilization that looked at the problem of how to crack a fortified naval chokepoint and thought, grow something. Sato was quiet for a long moment. They're going to be terrified. Yes. That's the point, isn't it? Not just the tactical effect, the terror. I picked up the cold coffee again and then put it back down without drinking it. The terror, he said, is what keeps them from thinking clearly about what we're actually doing while we're doing it. Yes. And what are we actually doing? I know the pieces. I want to hear you say the whole thing. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the tactical display, and then looked at something that was neither of those things, something further away, that existed in a place she couldn't quite follow him to. We're making them look at the corridor, he said, very carefully, very specifically at the corridor. He paused. While we're not in the corridor. Vethara's dead communication channel lasted 47 minutes. When it came back clean, no explanation, no error code, no logged interruption on the Kethsolara end, as if it had never happened. Her partial transmission had been received as gibberish, filed under asterisk technical fault, array degradation, and assigned a maintenance priority of 3, which meant it would be looked at sometime in the next week. She started the transmission again. This time she got through. You're reporting anomalous debris signatures, said the duty officer at Kethsolara, with the particular tone that senior officers used when they had decided before the conversation began that nothing they were about to hear warranted disrupting their evening. And a timestamp discrepancy of 13 minutes across 2 buoys. 3 buoys, Vethara said. I've expanded the comparative analysis. Buoy 19 shows the same pattern. 3 buoys malfunctioning simultaneously is statistically unlikely, Fleet Commander. It's statistically impossible, which means the buoys aren't malfunctioning. A pause. What are you suggesting? She chose her next words carefully, because she had served long enough to know that the words you used in the first 10 seconds of a conversation like this determined whether anyone listened to the next 10 minutes. I'm suggesting that something entered and exited the Karath corridor without triggering a single detection system we have, destroyed one of our frigates, and seeded the debris field with a biological compound I can't identify. And I'm suggesting that the civilization most likely capable of, or desperate enough to attempt, that kind of operation is Earth. Another pause, longer this time. Earth has 16 ships. Earth had 16 ships, she said. I would very much like to know what Earth has now. Nobody at Kethsolara revised the strategic assessment that night. This was the Dominion's third mistake, and it was the last one that could have been corrected before everything became irreversible. The assessment remained: non-threatening, resource extraction phase recommended, 16 ships, 14% combat effectiveness. The secondary line they'd held for 11 weeks was attributed to terrain advantages and dismissed. The biological accelerant was pending review. The timestamp discrepancy was attributed to instrument malfunction. Vethara spent 6 hours compiling everything into a formal threat escalation report, with a priority classification that should have put it on the Dominion High Command's desk by morning. She was promoted to Strategic Analyst, 3rd grade, 2 weeks later, which was the Dominion military's elegant mechanism for acknowledging that someone was saying something inconvenient without actually having to listen to it. She never forgot the smell. Here is what humanity had been doing for 14 months. Not building ships, not manufacturing weapons, not developing the kind of conventional military capacity that the Dominion's assessment models were designed to detect, measure, and quantify. Something older. The project had started as a theoretical, a xenobiology team at what had been the University of Nairobi, before the war, looking at the problem of deep space biological engineering from a perspective that had more to do with ecology than with weapons design. They weren't trying to build a weapon. They were trying to understand whether a living organism could be engineered to survive and function in vacuum conditions for extended periods, moving between structures, exploiting infrastructure vulnerabilities, operating with distributed collective intelligence that didn't require command signals that could be jammed or intercepted. They got further than anyone expected. OSI had found the project 6 months into the war, buried in a research database, flagged as * non-military, no strategic application identified. He'd read the summary report on a sleepless night in the operations center of the * Unbroken, and he'd sat with it for 3 hours before calling anyone. Then he'd called Sato. "Read this," he'd said, and he'd watched her face while she read it, and when she'd looked up and said, "This is insane," he'd said, "I know, that's why it'll work." 47,000 organisms, distributed through the structural framework of the Karath Corridor's navigational infrastructure, every relay station, every sensor buoy mounting, every docking anchor and tether line dormant and waiting. Biological, not electronic. Invisible to every sensor system, the Dominion operated because no one had ever told those sensors to look for something alive. They weren't weapons exactly. They were a message that was about to be delivered in a language the Dominion had no framework to translate. The thing Vethara's analysis had missed, the thing everyone had missed, because it required knowing something about human psychology that the Dominion's models treated as irrelevant data, was what OSI was willing to spend to make this work. The 16 ships were real. The resource constraint was real. The 7 months of retreat and the loss of the outer colonies were real, and they had cost something that didn't show up on any strategic assessment but that had shaped every decision OSI had made since the day the first colony fell. His daughter had been on Kepler Station. He did not talk about this. He did not include it in operational briefings. He did not let it inform his tactical calculations in any way that could be identified from the outside. But it informed everything, the way a crack in a foundation informs the weight distribution of a building. Invisibly, structurally, in ways that only become visible when something breaks. Sato knew. She had known since the day it happened, and she had watched him incorporate it into the specific architecture of how he thought about the war, and she had decided it made him more dangerous rather than less, which was either the correct strategic assessment or a profound moral failure, and she had never been entirely sure which. "We're going to lose the * meridian," he said, at 800 on the day the corridor operation began. Not a question. Statement of fact, delivered the same way he delivered weather reports. "I know," Sato said. "Chen knows, her crew knows, they volunteered." "I know that too." He was quiet. 308 people. "Yes." "To make the Dominion look at the corridor." "Yes." He picked up the cold coffee again. This time he drank it. "Make sure the record shows they volunteered. Make sure that's not bureaucratic language. Make sure someone who reads that record 50 years from now understands what that actually meant." "I'll write it myself," she said. The * Meridian entered the Karath corridor at 9:23. Alone. One human warship, broadcasting a standard military transponder signal that the Dominion sensors picked up immediately, clean, unencoded, practically an announcement. Every patrol in the corridor locked onto it within minutes. The Dominion Response Force, 7 vessels, repositioned to intercept with the efficient confidence of an organization that had not yet been given a reason to feel anything other than efficient confidence. It took them 22 minutes to reach engagement range. During those 22 minutes, the Meridian did something that the Dominion patrol commanders found inexplicable enough that 2 of them filed it in their action reports as a navigation error. It slowed down, not to a combat speed, not to a tactical positioning speed, to nearly a full stop in the center of the corridor in the worst possible defensive position, surrounded on 3 vectors. "They're not maneuvering," said the Dominion patrol lead to his weapons officer. His name was Tern Voss, and he was a competent officer who would die confused. "Why aren't they maneuvering?" "Unknown, possible systems failure." "Target their drives. Disable, don't destroy. I want to know what they're doing here." The weapons lock engaged. The * Meridian didn't evade. It sat there, broadcasting its clean transponder signal, while 7 Dominion warships drew weapons locks on it from 3 different vectors, and then it opened a channel. A human voice came through. Female. Calm in a way that Tern Voss would later describe as *wrong, not the calm of someone unafraid, but the calm of someone who had finished being afraid long ago and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. "Fleet Commander Tern Voss. My name is Captain Lin Chen, commanding officer of the EFS * Meridian. I want you to know that my crew is aware of our tactical situation. We understand what's about to happen." A pause. "We're not here to fight you. We're here to make sure you're looking at us." Tern Voss stared at the communication panel. "Is this a surrender transmission?" "No," another pause, shorter. "This is a distraction." The * Meridian's * reactor went to maximum output at 9:47. Not an explosion, not a cascade failure, but a deliberate, controlled electromagnetic pulse of a frequency that no one in that corridor had ever seen produced by a military vessel, because it wasn't a military system. It was a biological activation signal, specifically tuned, specifically timed. 47,000 organisms woke up simultaneously. The sensor readings that came back to Vethara's station 14 minutes later were so far outside any parameter she had reference for that the automated analysis system simply stopped working. It had no category for what it was seeing. It filed the data under sensor malfunction, complete system review recommended, and generated a maintenance ticket. Vethara read the raw data herself. She sat with it for a very long time. The corridor, the fortified, sensor-saturated, militarily impenetrable Karath corridor, was not behaving like a corridor anymore. The navigational infrastructure was compromised across 11 relay points simultaneously. The sensor buoys were dark. 3 of the 7 Dominion patrol vessels showed hull integrity warnings that corresponded to no weapons fire in the log. There was no energy weapon discharge in the record. There was no kinetic impact record. There was no record of any offensive action at all. There was biological matter distributed across the internal structure of 3 Dominion warships. Alive. Active. doing something to the ship's internal systems that was producing catastrophic effects without any weapon having been fired. "Get me the reserve fleet," she said quietly to Korath, who had been standing behind her for 4 minutes trying to decide whether to say something. "Emergency dispatch. All vessels. Get them to the corridor entrance now." "The corridor entrance is compromised, yes. Get them there anyway." She was still reading the raw data. "And get me Earth's last known diplomatic frequency." Korath turned from his console very slowly. "Earth's frequency." "Yes. We're opening a diplomatic channel to Earth." "Korath?" She turned and looked at him the same way she had looked at him when she'd asked him about the shape of the retreat. "We have never once asked Earth what they wanted. Not before the war, not during it. We assessed them, categorized them, assigned them a resource value, and built a strategy around the assumption that they would respond to military pressure the way every other civilization responds to military pressure." She looked back at the raw data on her screen, the impossible readings, the biological signatures, the dead sensors. "I want to know what Earth wants, before something worse than this happens." "Do you think something worse is possible?" She looked at the reading that showed biological matter active inside 3 of her warships. 3 warships that were currently sitting in the middle of the Karath corridor with their crews inside them. "I think," she said carefully, "that we have been catastrophically wrong about what Earth is capable of, and I think we've been wrong in a direction I don't fully understand yet, which means yes, I think something worse is possible. I think something much worse is possible. I think we haven't seen anything yet." She was right. The reserve fleet arrived at the corridor entrance 4 hours later. 46 vessels, the largest single concentration of Dominion military force in the sector, arrayed with textbook precision outside the compromised zone and waiting for Vethara's operational clearance before entering. I watched them arrive on the Unbroken's tactical display with the focused attention of someone checking whether a very specific thing was happening, and when he confirmed that it was, he made a sound that Sato had never heard from him before, something brief, exhaled, quiet, like a weight he'd been carrying had shifted by 1 degree. "They stopped at the entrance," she said. "They stopped at the entrance. They're not entering." "They're not entering," he agreed, "because Vethara told them not to, because Vethara is the only person in their command structure who has looked at the raw data and understood that she doesn't understand it." He was quiet for a moment. "She's the most dangerous person in that fleet. Because she's thinking clearly. Because she's thinking clearly and she's scared." He turned to his communications officer. "Open the diplomatic frequency." Sato straightened sharply. "Now we haven't. We've had the terms drafted for 3 months." "I know, but the timing." "The timing," he said, "is exactly right. They have 46 warships sitting outside a corridor they're afraid to enter, 3 damaged vessels with compromised hull integrity and active biological agents that they have no removal protocol for, 11 dead sensor relays, and a fleet commander who just filed what I guarantee is a very compelling threat escalation report and is waiting for someone to listen to her." He looked at Sato. "They are maximally uncertain right now. Uncertainty is what we need, not defeat, not destruction." He paused. "I don't want to win the war, Yemi. I want them to stop." The channel opened. Vethara's voice came through before Osai had finished composing his opening sentence. "Captain Osai," not a question. She knew or had guessed or had reasoned her way to the conclusion with the particular methodical stubbornness that he'd already identified as her defining characteristic from her intelligence file. "I have read your service record. I have read your psychological assessment, your tactical history, your pre-war academic work." A pause. "I have read the casualty report from Kepler Station." The operations center went very quiet. Sato looked at him. He didn't look back. "Then you know," he said carefully, "that I have a personal interest in this ending." "I know you have a personal interest in something ending. I'm not certain it's the war. Another pause. The organisms in my vessels, are they lethal to the crew? Not by design. By accident. I don't know, he said, which was the truth and which cost him something to say. We built them to compromise infrastructure, not to harm biological entities. But we built them quickly and under resource constraints and with a 14-month development timeline that should have been 5 years. He paused. I would like to get them out of your vessels before we find out whether my uncertainty is warranted. That's a concession. It's practical. It sounds like the beginning of a negotiation. It sounds like, he said, two people who are tired of losing things, trying to figure out whether there's a version of this where they don't lose anything else. Silence, long enough that he began counting seconds. The corridor, Vethara said finally. Your organisms, the biological accelerant in the original debris, the *Meridian's transmission, the one that said she was a distraction. A pause. What were you actually doing? Not the corridor, not the organisms, the real operation, the one I'm still not seeing. Os let the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds. If I tell you that, he said, you'll understand that you've already lost the corridor whether you enter it or not, and you'll have a much clearer picture of why the negotiation I'm about to propose is better for the Dominion than any military response you can construct. Then tell me. The corridor, he said, is the message. The corridor was always meant to be read, not held. He pulled up the secondary display, the one Sato had looked at 4 days ago, and said that's not possible. The organisms in your vessels are communicating with the organisms distributed across 11 other Dominion military installations in this sector. Installations you have not identified as compromised because we placed those organisms 3 months before the war began, when we were still trying to figure out whether the war was coming and were quietly making certain we had a way to end it quickly if it did. A pause that he measured very precisely. 47,000 in the corridor. What's in your other installations is approximately 10 times that number, and it's been growing. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Os had ever heard from a military channel. You seeded our installations, Vethara said finally, before the war. Before the war. You lost the outer colonies deliberately. He didn't answer immediately. That answer was in the territory of truth that cost more than other truths. Not deliberately, he said, but we made choices about what to spend and what to preserve, and the colonies were. He stopped, restarted. We made choices. 308 people on the Meridian. Yes. You sent them in there knowing what would happen. They volunteered, he said, and yes, I knew. And Kepler Station. The question was a blade, and she had placed it with surgical precision, and Osai felt it the way he felt the tremor in his hands. Something he had learned to metabolize without showing, without stopping, without letting become a reason to do anything differently than the math required. Kepler Station, he said, was not a choice I made. It was a choice someone else made, and it is why I'm on this channel right now, and it is why I built something that could end this before anyone else has to make the same kind of calculation. Vethara was quiet. Send me the removal protocol for the organisms, she said at last. The ones in my vessels, then send me the negotiation terms. The terms are simple. They always are, from the side that's winning. We're not winning, he said, and meant it completely. We have 16 ships, we have a dead colony, we have 308 crew members on a vessel that isn't coming back. We are not winning. We have made ourselves too expensive to continue fighting. He exhaled. That's the only kind of victory we could build with what we had. The removal protocol took 6 hours to transmit and 2 days to implement. The organisms, once given the correct deactivation signal, became inert and were recovered by environmental teams who required full biological isolation suits, and who filed reports describing the organisms as architecturally sophisticated in a way inconsistent with a 14-month development timeline, which was a polite way of saying they suspected humanity had been working on this longer than they were admitting. They were right. OS had started the theoretical groundwork 23 months before the war, at a point when the Dominion's expansion trajectory had made certain conclusions arithmetically unavoidable for anyone willing to look at the projections without institutional optimism editing the results. He had looked at the projections. He had made preparations. He had not, in 23 months, told anyone in the Earth government what he was doing, because he had assessed, correctly, that any formal program would generate bureaucratic oversight that would generate information security risk, that would generate exactly the kind of intelligence signal that would tell the Dominion to accelerate their timeline before humanity was ready. He had done it unofficially, quietly, with a xenobiology team that thought they were doing theoretical research and a logistics network that thought it was running supply exercises, and a communications officer who had been forwarding encrypted traffic for 2 years, and who OSA had told, with complete honesty, that the traffic was classified at a level she didn't have clearance for, and that she should treat it as routine and not think about it further. The formal inquiry into the chain of command authority for the entire operation would last 4 years and conclude, with evident bureaucratic discomfort, that Captain Dara Os had conducted a multi-year covert strategic operation against a hostile power, on behalf of Earth, without being formally authorized to do so by anyone above the rank of his own conscience. The inquiry recommended no disciplinary action. This was the part of the record Sato wrote herself. The negotiation lasted 11 days. Vethara conducted it from Kethsolara, working 18-hour sessions with 3 separate Dominion diplomatic teams who rotated through the channel while she stayed constant, because she had decided that consistency on their side of the table was the most important variable she could control. She was promoted twice during the negotiation, which complicated the question of who actually had the authority to sign the final terms, a complication that the Dominion legal apparatus was still working through long after the terms had been signed and implemented. On the 9th day, during a 6-hour break while the Dominion teams reviewed a revised framework, she opened a private channel to Osai. "I have a question," she said, "that isn't part of the negotiation." "Ask it." "The biological accelerant in the original debris, the first thing I found," a pause, "that wasn't from the organisms." He waited. "That was from something else, something you haven't mentioned in any of the technical documentation." He was quiet for long enough that she might have thought the channel had dropped, except she could hear the ambient sound of the Unbroken's Operations Center in the background. "That question," he said at last, "is above the classification level of this channel. You classified something above an active diplomatic negotiation." "I classified something above everything," he said, "including this negotiation, including me. If the negotiation concludes successfully, it becomes irrelevant, and I'll be very pleased for it to stay classified forever. If it doesn't conclude successfully," he stopped, "it becomes relevant, and I genuinely hope it doesn't become relevant." She considered this for a very long time. "The organisms in our installations," she said slowly, "the ones you said were 10 times the corridor count, are those all the same type?" The silence that followed was longer than any previous silence in the negotiation. "Vethara," Osai said finally, and there was something in the way he said her name, without title, without rank, just the name, that made her understand that she had just asked the question he had been hoping she wouldn't ask until it was too late to matter. "Close this line. Go back to the negotiating table. Sign the terms." "How many types are there?" "Close the line." "Osai, how many?" "There is one type that compromises infrastructure," he said. There is one type that you've seen, that we've discussed, that we've provided removal protocols for. A pause so short it was almost not a pause at all. Sign the terms, Vethara, please. She signed the terms the next morning. She never asked about the second type again. This was, she would eventually conclude, the correct decision. Not because the answer would have been worse than what she imagined, although she believed it probably was, but because some questions, once formally asked, require formal answers, and formal answers require formal responses, and she had looked at Captain Dara Os across 11 days of negotiation and understood. With the particular clarity of someone who had spent 40 years reading dangerous people, that his formal response to that question was something she could not afford to discover. The treaty was signed. The corridor was opened. The organisms in the Dominion installations were deactivated by the same signal that had woken them, and recovered by the same teams in the same isolation suits, and the final count was slightly higher than 470,000 rather than the 470,000 OS had documented in the disclosure. The discrepancy was small, 1,300 organisms. The Dominion analysts attributed it to counting error. Vethara attributed it to humanity, which she had learned was the same as attributing it to something that had been planning further ahead than anyone had thought to look, adapting to conditions that hadn't existed yet when the planning began, and refusing, constitutionally, fundamentally, almost biologically refusing, to accept the version of events where the end of the story was already written. The formal Dominion Strategic Intelligence Division assessment of the Karath Corridor incident was completed 14 months after the treaty was signed. It ran to 912 pages and was classified at the highest available level, which meant that in practice, about 40 people in the entire Dominion had read it. Vethara had written 211 of those pages herself. Her section was titled, Operational Misinterpretation, a Systematic Analysis of Assumption Failure. The summary conclusion, which her commanding officer had required her to reduce to a single paragraph for the executive briefing document, read as follows. At every stage of the pre-war assessment and the conflict itself, the Dominion Strategic Intelligence Division evaluated Earth's military capacity through established threat metrics designed to measure what a civilization could field in a conventional engagement. These metrics were accurate. Earth could not win a conventional engagement. The metrics were also entirely irrelevant. Earth had never intended to win a conventional engagement. Earth had identified, at some point prior to the commencement of hostilities that we cannot precisely date, but which may precede our own initial assessment of them as a military threat, that conventional engagement was not available to them, and had therefore built a strategy around a form of capability that our metrics were not designed to detect. This is not a flaw in our metrics. This is a fundamental difference in how Earth approaches an impossible problem. Where established strategic doctrine advises reallocation of resources, consolidation of defensible position, and negotiation from whatever strength remains, Earth appears to operate under a different principle entirely, one that the available evidence suggests could be summarized as, the problem is impossible, therefore unconventional methods are the only methods, therefore we will build the unconventional methods and accept whatever it costs to build them. The Karath Corridor incident is not an anomaly in Earth's strategic behavior. Based on a retrospective analysis of their pre-war actions, the Kepler station casualties, and the nature of the biological program itself, it is the predictable output of a civilization that has decided the only losing condition they recognize is the decision to stop. She filed the report. She received her promotion. She moved to a position at high command where she spent the next 6 years quietly redesigning the Dominion's threat assessment frameworks to include biological capability detection, psychological profile depth analysis, and what she labeled in the internal documentation as asterisk desperation index, a metric for measuring not what a civilization had, but what it was willing to do when it believed it had no other option. The metric became standard across 37 allied intelligence services over the following decade. It was, and remained, triggered by only one civilization in the database. Osai retired 2 years after the treaty. Not officially. Officially, he was promoted to admiral and given a desk and a title, and a set of responsibilities that were both entirely real and entirely beside the point of what the promotion was actually doing, which was placing him somewhere visible and honorable and quiet, where the chain of command above him could be confident that the man who had run a 4-year unauthorized covert operation with live biological weapons across multiple Dominion military installations was no longer in a position to do anything similar without approximately 9 layers of formal approval. He accepted this gracefully, which Sato told him was either evidence of emotional maturity or evidence that he'd already set something else in motion. He smiled when she said it, which was not a denial. He kept the coffee cold. He had developed in the years since the treaty a habit of looking at the sky at night, at whatever sky was available, whether it was Earth's or a station viewport or the half-obscured dome of an orbital facility, with the particular expression of someone doing math in their head. Not anxious math, not desperate math. The kind of math that has already identified the problem and is working on the shape of the solution at a pace that has no regard for urgency, because urgency, in his experience, was what you felt when you thought you were running out of time. And he had learned, more completely than almost anyone alive, that you were never as close to the end as the situation made you believe. The galaxy had looked at Earth and seen 16 ships. 16 ships retreating. 16 ships cornered. 16 ships and a civilization that any rational assessment said was months from collapse, from absorption, from becoming a footnote in the Dominion's expansion record. A resource-rich world with an interesting history and a brief, unsuccessful period of independent military resistance. They had counted the ships. They had not counted the other things. The people who stayed up past the point of reason, building something impossible in a university lab because the mathematics of the situation made it necessary. The crew of the Asterisk Meridian, who had understood exactly what they were doing and had done it anyway calmly, in the particular calm of those who had finished being afraid and arrived somewhere the fear couldn't follow. The captain who had looked at the wreckage of everything he loved and used it as a foundation for something that wasn't revenge and wasn't victory and wasn't quite hope either, but was the specific human thing that sits between those three and has no clean name. The decision to continue, past the point where continuation makes sense, until the universe is forced to recalculate. Somewhere in the Dominion's classified archives, Vethara's metrics sat in a database with a single species flagged red. Not because they were the strongest. Not because they were the fastest, the most advanced, the most rational, the most prepared. Because the metrics designers had built it to answer one question and one question only. At what point does a civilization stop? And after 14 months of analysis and 912 pages of documentation, and a career spent redesigning every threat assessment framework the Dominion operated, Vethara had been forced to enter, in the field marked asterisk estimated cessation threshold, asterisk. Unknown possibly does not exist. She looked at that line for a long time after she typed it. Then she looked at the sky, which was a different sky than Osai's but which contained the same stars, the same distances, the same cold arithmetic of space that had been telling humanity for centuries that it was too small and too alone and too fragile to matter. Humanity had been listening to that arithmetic for a very long time. It had simply never agreed with the conclusion.